The relationship between the cannabis plant and humankind is prehistoric. Believed to have originated as a wild plant in Asia, it was present at the very beginnings of agriculture and has been in our service ever since. The small seed of the cannabis plant is a highly nutritious food and also produces a high-quality, multi-purpose oil. Its stalk is the source of a durable fiber which helped provide the raw material for clothing the earliest human communities.
Hemp probably is the oldest crop of multiple use benefits to humankind, as far as we understand it. You could eat it, you could wear it, to say the least.
Hemp seed is the #1 most nutritious food you can put in your body. Gruel is hemp seed and water. Entire civilizations have subsisted on it in times of famine.
The smoking or ingestion of the budding parts of the cannabis plant for their euphoric effects has also played a part in our history as social custom, medicine, and as a religious ritual.
The Scythian warriors coming out of Mongolia and the steppes of Europe over there carried this herb into battle with them. It was both a medicine and a relaxant, and they found Scythian princesses buried with it in their pouches alongside their weapons and their horse.
Cannabis sativa has been used all over the world by a wide variety of cultures in a wide variety of different countries. It's by no means anything unique to the United States. And so I think as people began to use cannabis sativa in a wide variety of ways, they began to notice that there were really a lot of distinctive different uses, one for industrial purposes. So a lot of varieties were specifically bred for industrial uses, primarily for the fiber and the oil that came from the plant. Whereas other cultures were more interested in using cannabis sativa for other more personal uses or cultural purposes, and that would be those varieties that have the higher THC content.
Our own language reflects the dual nature of the cannabis plant and reveals a certain disconnect between the two aspects of the same species of plant. Hemp is the common name for the once important fiber crop, which was cultivated in North America beginning with the arrival of the Europeans. The word marijuana, which originated in Spanish-speaking America, conjures a very different image and history. In the lexicon of contemporary American slang, there is no shortage of synonyms for this word, which refers to the plant first criminalized by the federal government in 1937, known variously as pot, grass, weed, smoke, and reefer. The history of hemp in America begins with the first agricultural endeavors of the colonial period. Hemp had been an indispensable article of trade throughout Europe since earliest times, and had been used virtually all over the world to make all types of fiber-based commodities, from clothing to fishing nets to writing paper.
In England in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, there were provinces and areas of England where it was mandatory that the people grow some block of hemp for the kingdom.
Despite the need, a less than prolific hemp culture existed in the British Isles, resulting in a chronic reliance on imported fiber. That dependency caused considerable anxiety for the British, especially whenever war threatened to cut off their supply. With the establishment of colonies in North America, the English were eager to introduce the seed and strongly encouraged the colonial farmer to plant hemp alongside his other crops. Key to their enthusiasm was that no other fiber was as well suited for transformation into the strong, flexible sails, rope, and rigging so important to the British Navy. Hemp was excellent in this regard as it resisted the corrosive effects of saltwater, and when it did begin to fail as rigging, it was picked apart and used for caulking the hulls of the wooden ships. Hemp was an essential commodity for a nation which wished to expand its influence and its wealth by dominion over the world's oceans. For all its utility, hemp culture expanded very slowly in colonial America. In the South, it lagged behind tobacco, which became a very profitable article of trade for the colonists in Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas. Despite persistent urging from England to produce more hemp, the Southerners were content to rely on tobacco as their chief money crop. In 1700, Massachusetts attempted to encourage her fledgling hemp industry by requiring all manufacturers of rope to use only fiber grown within her borders. The early shipbuilders along the northeast coast, whose industry had always been dependent on imported hemp, saw the value of a ready supply of good fiber on their side of the Atlantic. George Washington, a hemp farmer himself, saw great potential for the Virginia farmer, but lamented the glut of foreign fiber, mostly Russian hemp, in the colonial market. Despite the many years of inducements and prodding, Americans remained dependent on foreign hemp even as they achieved their own political independence. Freed from the constraints of their colonial past and looking for new and greener pastures, the more adventurous citizens of the new nation began to leave their homes along the eastern seaboard and follow the wilderness road through the Appalachian Mountains, or sail down the Ohio River into the rich, abundant lands of the West. The stories of the rich rolling lands and flowing waters of the central plateau of Kentucky enticed many across the mountains, as did the generosity of the Virginia legislature, which offered to deed 400 acres to those who would make settlement in Kentucky by building a cabin. As added incentive, those who planted corn would receive 1,000 more.
Land was being worn out back in Virginia. There were all sorts of political and social problems developed in that on the eve of the Revolution and then in the Revolution itself. And land became a magnet that drew people west, almost in a frantic population movement. They dreamed, and I don't, historians have discussed this, I don't actually know how firmly most of them knew about this or dreamed of the Eden of the West, that here they would get away from their troubles back east. Here they would certainly make their fortunes in this good land.
The first documentation of hemp being grown in Kentucky was in 1775, and that was by Archibald McNeil in Boyle County, and he grew a small crop, not for sale, but probably just for home use.
Hemp can be grown in a wide range of climates and conditions, but factors like the length of the growing season, soil quality, amounts of rainfall, and proper drainage are critical to the strength and length of the fibers the plant will produce. The dark, fertile soil and mild seasons of central Kentucky seemed particularly well suited to the task and produced tall, healthy stands with strong fibers and a minimum amount of wood in the stalk.
If you direct plant seed in the soil, it comes up, it's a weed, just like tobacco's a weed. They both grow very quickly, and the hemp seed will grow and the other weed seeds come up, but hemp is such a vigorous plant, and the way we raise it, it's so thick, it'll outgrow all the other weeds and kill them. It shades them, and they die.
The plant's natural hardiness and resistance to disease helped it proliferate on the frontier, despite the primitive farming methods. A farmer could sow as much seed as he had available, and in a good season be assured that he would have a substantial crop in just a few months. Once harvested, the fiber suffered very little from spoilage, making it ideal for storage and transport. The chronic shortage of cash money on the frontier also made hemp a valuable commodity for farmers who could exchange their crop in payment for needed goods. In 1788, the first newspaper in the West, the Kentucky Gazette, established in Lexington the year before, offered to take bundles of raw hemp in payment for subscriptions. By 1800, Kentucky's log cabin economy had been transformed into a diverse and thriving agricultural economy, and the pioneer's little hemp patch had become a profitable and extensive enterprise. John Wesley Hunt, the state's first millionaire, made a substantial part of his fortune in the wholesale trade and manufacture of hempen products. In the 5-county area surrounding Lexington, it appeared that the American hemp industry had found a place where it might flourish. And indeed, for many years, the bluegrass region of Kentucky was the center of hemp production in the United States. Making his way from Lexington to Frankfort or down through Versailles to Danville, a traveler in the post-Revolutionary War period in Kentucky would have been struck by the recurring sight of dance stands of leafy plants that stretched across the wide fields. At summer's end, the plants would stand 10 to 12 feet in height, and the traveler would have seen workers, mostly black slaves, bent in the fields, cutting the stalks, tying them in bundles, and stacking them in shocks. In the late autumn, the bundles would be broken up and the stalks spread across the fields, exposing them to the early winter rains and freezes. The process, called dew retting, frees the desired fiber from the resin which holds it to the woody center portion of the stalk. After retting, the stalks are picked up and reshocked, allowing them to dry before the breaking. In dry weather, the workers would return to the fields carrying their crude wooden breaking benches. Moving from shock to shock, they would separate the fine fiber from the woody herds by throwing the heavy lever of the hemp brake. The extracted fiber was then tied into loose bundles and stored in a dry part of the barn. At the end of a day of breaking, the piles of discarded herds were burned in the fields, signaling the end of another growing season. Along with the expansion of hemp cultivation, the manufacture of hempen goods had been progressing in the States since the days when the first settlers had spun crude hempen cloth on their spinning wheels as an improvement on the nettle lint and buffalo wool they had been using to make fabric.
The very earliest huntsmen came in here had to wear skins for clothing. Coonskin cap, everything they had on was coons. Their leggings and their feet were made out of animal hides. All right, you bring your family, they're going to wear animal hides until one of about 2 or 3 things. You either can manage to have with sheep, you can plant flax, or you can plant hemp.
Hemp was actually spun in the home. You could do the entire process to actually end up with clothing or textile fabric right in the home itself. The hemp might have been grown on the farm, and then of course you would do the retting or the rotting of the fibers, and then on to the hackling and the spinning, and then the weaving, and then making something into cloth. So that was easily done as a process right at home.
Cordage of various kinds was another necessity of frontier life, and smaller types of twine and rope could be produced at home without the aid of special equipment. As time went on, the demand for larger lengths and widths of rope for use in shipping and industry brought about the development of rope manufacturing sites known as rope walks. A rope walk was a long, narrow building, usually a wooden structure, with a hand-turned wheel at one end. Sometimes a horse or mule would be used to supply the power. The rope maker would attach a bundle of combed or hackled hemp to a hook on the wheel, and walking backward would twist the fibers around one another as they were drawn out of the bundle. The long yarns of fiber were in turn spun together for the desired width of rope. 2 events occurred in the American South in the 1790s which were to have a tremendous effect on the early hemp industry in Kentucky and later in the Midwest. The first occurred in 1795 with the signing of the Pinckney Treaty between the U.S. and Spain, which allowed Americans the right to freely navigate the entire length of the Mississippi River. It gave early traders much wider access to markets through the port of New Orleans. The second was the invention of the cotton gin. Prior to 1793, the use of cotton had been greatly limited by the difficulty of separating the lint from the seed. The development of the cotton gin in that year revolutionized the cotton industry and gave birth to the new king of the South.
Once you invent that little cotton gin, which is a very simple thing, once you develop that thing and then refined it and built larger gins, the cotton belt expanded just like wildfire.
In order to protect the cotton during shipment to the textile mills of Europe and New England, it had to be tightly compressed into bales and then covered and bound with strong material. Durable hemp bagging and cordage from Kentucky provided the answer. For each 300-pound bale of cotton, 15 pounds of hemp bagging and rope were required to suitably clothe the king. By 1802, 250,000 pounds of cordage alone was being shipped from the port of Louisville down the Ohio River to the Mississippi and on to New Orleans. In 1810, a visitor to Kentucky named Thomas Joines noted, "The inhabitants of Lexington now turn their attention almost entirely to the cultivation of hemp, for which they find their soil adapted and which is more profitable than anything else they can grow." It appeared to many that for as long as this mutually beneficial relationship continued, the hemp industry would surely prosper right alongside King Cotton. The early years of the 19th century also saw the expansion of the American shipbuilding industry along the northeast coast, as well as the growth of the U.S. naval fleet. Both were large consumers of hemp for marine use. A three-masted frigate like the USS Constitution required 30 tons of hempen rigging, tow lines, caulking, and sailcloth to be properly outfitted. In the West, Kentucky hemp was playing an important role in the development of the riverboat trade, but the large and potentially lucrative seaboard market to the east remained out of reach.
It was very difficult to transport anything overland or upstream. Anything in volume, it was nearly impossible to transport it out of this region. All heavy stuff had to be shipped downriver, and if it was going to some other place, picked up by sailboats that traded up the Atlantic coast.
The shipbuilders of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, who had enjoyed reliable access to foreign sources of hemp in Europe and India, saw the situation change in the early 1800s. War in Europe and a second war with Britain in 1812 caused the U.S. Congress to enact embargo and non-importation legislation which tightened supplies. As prices began to rise on the East Coast, the Kentuckians saw their opportunity to become competitive and perhaps even replace the foreign suppliers in the eastern market. Led by their able statesman Henry Clay, the Kentuckians became great advocates of the tariff on hemp and demanded that Congress leave it in place, even after the hostilities had ceased. Clay's eloquence, as he argued for protectionism and America's commercial self-reliance, won him the nickname the Prince of Hemp and became the foundation of his 1824 bid for the presidency.
Clay, as a state legislator, had a suit made out of hemp and fiber, and he appeared in the Kentucky legislature dressed in a hempen suit, advocating for the protection and production of the crop.
In spite of the efforts, the Kentucky farmer was never able to claim more than a modest share of the northeastern market, even at the height of protectionism. An underlying reason for this may have been the practice of dew-retting his crop in the field, a practice that many in the marine industry felt resulted in an inferior product. It appears that though the Buy American idea was always politically attractive, Russian hemp, which was rented in the early snowfalls of the Baltic region, was perceived by most Navy men to be more consistent in strength and better prepared for market than its American cousin.
But with all the political clout that Kentucky had in Washington, Henry Clay and others, they were never able to capture that naval market.
Politicians from Kentucky and Missouri always protested, but the Navy continued to purchase most of their hemp abroad, even when forced to pay a higher price. The quality issue was never settled, and as time went on, it became less relevant. The advent of the steam engine was slowly doing away with the great sailing ships and reducing the need for anybody's hemp. If a golden age of hemp culture ever existed in America, the decades leading up to the Civil War could make the claim. In spite of its troubles, market forces and new technologies conspired to create a period of prosperity and relative stability in the industry, which lasted into the 1850s. The introduction of the steamboat in the early 1800s on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers had revolutionized transportation in the West and greatly increased the flow of commerce up and down the rivers. In the years that followed, American cotton became a prized commodity worldwide and kept the southern planter a reliable customer for hemp bagging and cordage factories upriver. Though market prices fluctuated, hemp cultivation remained a critical part of the economic foundation for Kentucky farmers, even as it expanded into the Midwestern states of Missouri, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, and Kansas. During this period, Kentucky hemp continued to be the state's leading money crop, second only to livestock in returning dollars to the farm. In 1849, the state could boast that it possessed one-third of the nation's hemp factories. There were some 159 in operation statewide, producing bale rope, cordage, linen, duck canvas, bagging, and sailcloth. Production in the U.S. peaked in 1859 on the eve of the Civil War, with a bumper crop of 40,000 tons of raw, field-broken hemp. The growth of the hemp industry in antebellum Kentucky was generated in large measure by the use of slave labor. Slaves had been brought to the area as early as 1775, and their number had steadily grown. It is not accidental that the largest concentrations were located in the hemp-producing regions of the state.
Hemp and slavery were almost synonymous. At that moment when you needed help, you had to be thoroughly convinced that you had help enough to handle the crop. You didn't need them all year, but you certainly need them maybe at planting time, but desperately at harvest time.
Compared with the cotton-producing states, Kentucky's agriculture had remained more diverse in nature, keeping her less dependent on slave labor, at least directly. However, Kentuckians were actively involved in the slave trade, and many Kentucky-born slaves were sold to work in the cotton fields down south. With the outbreak of hostilities at Fort Sumter, the Southerners immediately declared an embargo on cotton and halted all exportation of its most prized commodity, believing an international shortage would be a good bargaining chip with the Europeans, especially the English, who were extremely dependent on cotton to keep their huge milling industry humming.
As a matter of fact, that was a basic factor in the Southern hope in the Civil War, that Britain would come in on the side of the South. Britain, however, had on hand, I saw the figures not long ago, enough cotton to run, I think, 3 or 4 years. So Britain didn't need the cotton. And that was a miscalculation on the part of the South.
The naval blockades and strict prohibitions on trade imposed by the North guaranteed the economic isolation of the South. For the hemp industry in Kentucky, its fate historically and literally tied to cotton, the war dealt a severe blow from which it would never fully recover. With the halt to all shipping of rope and bagging downriver, factories throughout the state began to shut down. The only potential bright spot for the industry during the war years was that with the sudden withdrawal of cotton from the textile market, other fiber crops were considered as possible substitutes for use as clothing. In Kentucky, the practice of weaving hemp on old hand looms experienced a revival, and several factories were brought back into production, making cloth from both flax and hemp in the hope of cashing in on the scarcity of cotton. The war also increased the demand for ship sail and rigging, and the War Department attempted to purchase domestic hemp where it was available. However, with the disruptions to the workforce and supply lines, no one was able to take advantage of the situation. In fact, the war helped to speed the adoption of many nautical innovations, such as steam power, wire rope, steel hulls, chains, and rods, all of which would forever change the role of hemp on the high seas. When the war ended, the cotton growers returned to their fields to find their product in great demand throughout the world. Once again, the need for stout rope and bagging sparked the hemp industry back to life. Prices climbed steadily to their pre-war high, and by 1869, Kentucky had regained her role as the nation's principal producer. It appeared to all that the good times had surely returned. But in fact, the cotton growers had never been completely satisfied with hemp as the solution to their transportation problems. The Southerners had long been unhappy with the cost of hemp, and many complained that the ropes tended to expand, causing the bales to come apart, creating extra work and expense on their part. In the post-war years, cheaper imported materials began to find their way into the cotton markets, and by 1870, a system which combined stronger iron hoops with cheaper bagging made of jute from India rapidly displaced hemp in the baling of cotton.
Once you introduced steel ties into buying cotton bales, you killed off the market for bale rope, just dead.
Seemingly overnight, the hemp industry, so dependent on the Southern market for its lifeblood, looked as if it were about to vanish from the American landscape. From its peak levels of some 40,000 tons just before the Civil War, U.S. production dropped by 90% to just over 5,000 tons by 1878, with almost the total amount coming from Kentucky. The last decades of the 19th century saw the further retreat of hemp culture in America as the market became dominated by an abundance of cheaper, imported fibers like abaca from the Philippines, sisal from Africa, henequen from Mexico, jute from India, and hemp from Russia and Italy. In 1900, Kentucky's famous novelist James Lane Allen published a poetic remembrance of the industry. In his novel The Reign of Law, subtitled A Tale of the Kentucky Hemp Fields, he revels in his boyhood days in Old Kentucky and laments the fall of the one-time great crop from its place of honor.
The Anglo-Saxon farmers had scarce conquered foothold, stronghold, freehold in the western wilderness before they became sowers of hemp. Away back in the days when they lived with wife, child, flock in frontier wooden fortresses and hardly ventured forth for water, salt, game, or tillage, hemp was growing tall and thick near the walls of the fort. Hemp in Kentucky in 1782, early landmark in the history of the soil, of the people, cultivated first for the needs of cabin and clearing solely, for twine and rope, towel and table, sheet and shirt. By and by, not for cabin and clearing only, not for tow-homespun, fur-clad Kentucky alone. To make way for it, a forest the like of which no human eye will ever see again was felled. The roads of Kentucky, those long limestone turnpikes connecting the towns and villages with farms, they were early made necessary by the hauling of hemp. For the sake of it, slaves were perpetually being trained, hired, bartered, lands perpetually rented and sold, fortunes made or lost. What phase of life went unaffected by the pursuit and fascination of it? Thought, care, hope of the farmer oftentimes throughout the entire year. Upon it depending, it may be, the college of his son, the accomplishments of his daughter, the luxuries of his wife, the house he would build, the stock he could own, his own pleasures also, all these depending in large measure upon his hemp, that thickest gold dust of his golden acres.
The beginning of the 20th century found American hemp a minor crop with production limited to small regions in Kentucky and parts of central Wisconsin. The U.S. farmers still contributed a small amount of hemp to manufacturers of baling twine and thread, but the wide variety of low-cost, high-quality fibers readily imported from third world countries, like the Philippines and Africa, kept domestic hemp production at marginal levels. Always the war baby, the interruption of shipping caused by World War I created some interest in American hemp, and production increased each year of the war's duration, but quickly waned with the return to peacetime. During this period, a new chapter in America's relationship with cannabis began to take shape.
During the early 20th century, we began to see a lot more evidence that people were smoking various varieties of cannabis sativa that were specifically bred for their THC content. During this period, we had a lot of hashish coming over from the Orient, a lot of coca coming up from South America, a lot of opium coming from both the Middle East and again Southeast Asia. So I think we began a whole different drug culture, which created, I think, a whole different perspective on this particular plant, cannabis sativa, which introduced a lot of varieties that were very, very different from the varieties that Americans were historically accustomed to.
Each time the United States enters into a world war, we rediscover THC. The United States is actually an alcohol-based culture and has been for many years, and they've used immigrants from other societies that had THC-based society, such as the Chinese or the Mexicans who understood what this plant was. They would use it as kind of a prejudicial basis for prejudice. Oh, look at those people smoking that dope. And here we are over here drinking shots of rye and tequila and stuff like this. The United States, being an alcohol-based, has always used THC-based societies, their use of THC is kind of that which set them apart and made them subhuman or lesser human beings.
The first laws against the use of marijuana were enacted in the early 1900s in the southwestern states along the Mexican border and in Louisiana, where West Indian sailors had introduced the smoking of marijuana into the nightclub and early jazz scene of New Orleans. By the 1920s, marijuana use was showing up in other urban areas, and a campaign against reefer madness had emerged, featuring sensationalized films and newspaper accounts describing how honor students became crazed or homicidal after smoking a marijuana cigarette. With very little evidence of widespread use and no clear consensus on the health effects of smoking the plant, the U.S. Congress, at the behest of the Bureau of Narcotics, passed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 to discourage all cultivation of the cannabis sativa plant by imposing an occupational excise tax on anyone engaged in the commerce or cultivation of cannabis.
The operative part of the Marijuana Tax Act was a transfer tax, and for transferring it pertained to the leafy part of the plant as far as the transfer tax, and there was a fee of $1 an ounce if it was to be transferred to a registered participant. But it was $100 an ounce if it was to be transferred to an unregistered participant.
Registered participants included the manufacturers of paints and varnishes who used hemp seed oil in their products, suppliers of birdseed, and the manufacturers of medicinal products such as corn plasters and various remedies used by veterinarians. Unregistered participants, it was assumed, would be marijuana dealers. Though it was alleged by the prohibitionists to cause unwitting citizens to commit violent crimes, the politicians who had seen the complete failure and subsequent repeal of the prohibition on alcohol a few years before stopped short of outlawing cannabis outright. But even as a tax, the legislation provided the government a large measure of control with very real penalties for those who failed to comply.
Now, pardon me, I don't think marijuana was a problem back in 1937. It certainly wasn't a problem. It's certainly not a problem today, and it's all over the place. So I don't know how it could possibly have been a problem in 1937, except for the fact that when they passed that law, for the first time, the federal government took over the right to tell you what seed you could plant in the ground and what you could do with the product of that seed.
Simultaneously, what was happening from a commercial perspective is that industrial hemp was really losing its stand here in U.S. agriculture. There were a lot of other alternative fibers that were coming in. We had a lot of manila hemp coming in, which is not cannabis sativa. We also had sisal coming in from the Orient, cotton coming in from the Middle East, abaca coming in from Southeast Asia, as well as a lot of synthetic materials, particularly during World War II, that were coming in to supplant the price effectiveness or competitiveness of industrial hemp in the commercial agricultural market.
The hemp industry did undergo increased scrutiny as a result of the tax, but the law provided an exemption for the stalk portion of the plant, requiring the few farmers still growing hemp to register with the Treasury Department. But a token payment of a $1 a year occupational tax was all that was required to keep producing hemp. The campaign against marijuana, which originated with state and federal law enforcement officials, was bureaucratic in nature and hysterical in tone. It succeeded largely because it circumvented any attempts for a true public or scientific debate on the issue. The prohibitionists deftly fused marijuana usage with the deep-seated racial fears and the isolationist tendencies of America in the 1930s, and the result was the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. 1 year after the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, an article in Popular Mechanics magazine predicted the unprecedented reflowering of hemp culture. It observed that new uses and the recent development of improved processing machinery were about to bring the nearly extinct crop back into the limelight, replacing the numerous foreign fibers and creating a new billion-dollar cash crop for the country's farmers. But what no one predicted was that in less than 4 years, more than 14,000 U.S. farmers would be under contract to the federal government to grow hemp on 178,000 acres of prime farmland. Like the First World War, the outbreak of World War II halted the importation of hemp from Russia and Italy. And once again, hostilities somewhere in the world caused a resurgence of America's hemp industry. This time, however, conditions worsened with Japan's entry into the war, cutting off America's principal source of fiber, abaca from the Philippines, commonly called Manila hemp. The situation threatened to limit not only America's buildup of military forces, but also impede the growth of wartime agricultural production.
It was desperately sought to help save the lives, first to make parachutes, and equally to have rope sufficient. And then they found out those little U-boats, two-man German subs could shoot a hole in the ship, but it wasn't too damnish big. So if they take a hemp rug and drop it over the side, they could pump enough to save the troops' lives.
By the spring of 1942, a major government-sponsored campaign was in full swing, hoping to persuade farmers to grow the fibers so vital to the war effort. A corporation, War Hemp Industries, was put in place to purchase the crops and manage the operation of some 70 processing sites proposed for speedy construction in Kentucky and throughout the Midwest. The hemp-marijuana connection was, for the most part, forgotten during this period, though participating farmers were required to register with the U.S. Treasury. By the end of 1943, the world's shipping situation had eased to the point where large amounts of sisal were being imported from British East Africa, and U.S. stockpiles of fiber began to return to acceptable levels. With the emergency over, the government began dismantling the hemp program, and production quickly decreased as foreign fibers began to dominate the market once again. Since the participating farmers had not invested heavily in the venture, there was little resistance to ending the program, and most simply returned to growing more profitable crops like corn and tobacco. In the span of a few years, the U.S. government had gone from condemnation to adulation in their public relations campaigns for and against the cannabis plant. As the war came to an end, the crop, which had been cast as both criminal and war hero, looked as if it were headed toward extinction once again.
After World War II, because the U.S. government had reauthorized industrial hemp production, although it had failed to a certain extent in terms of helping, quote, the war effort, several farmers continued to raise industrial hemp for commercial purposes through the 1950s and even into the early 1960s. However, at this time, because of the growing awareness of the drug problem, growing trade in drug use, growing evidence of drug abuse here in the United States, we made the production of industrial hemp illegal once again. This first happened in the 1950s, but some of the laws that were put in place weren't very clear. There were some loopholes around them, etc. So farmers continued to raise industrial hemp for the next couple of years, but commercially it was a failure, and legally they continued to get themselves into trouble. So it really pretty much collapsed in the early 1960s.
67, Kentucky threw the baby out with the wash. They just said, boom, anything to do with hemp, including the plant or the seed, is wrong, illegal. Then the feds got smart and came along, 68 or 70, somewhere. And you wonder why the people quit roaming and looking for it in the country. They found out they got more headaches than they did highs, because it's a farrow plant or a wild plant which came from the seed. The seed will stay in there or something for a very long period. It wasn't doing them much good. That's the reason it's become the largest of all crops in America, but it's treated horticulturally rather than agriculturally.
Exactly where it came from and how it got to be a part of our society from the 60s on is it's unclear. Some people theorize that it was the soldiers who came back from World War II. A lot of them had served in the South Pacific and in a lot of the tropical and subtropical countries where marijuana was still a part of life there. It was part of their religion, part of their customs, and so when the soldiers came back, some of them brought that custom back with them.
At the end of the Korean War, World War II, they really came down on it. Life in prison for a joint. They really suppressed it. They didn't want all these soldiers discovering THC and coming back here, having discovered it. Same thing at the end of the Korean War. At the end of the Vietnam War, not only did they lose their control of war-making apparatus and the way to make more war, their inability to control the Vietnam War was also mirrored by their inability to suppress this plant with the soldiers when they discovered it over in Vietnam. And so they bought it back and turned on my generation to it. I was turned on to marijuana by a very good friend who was an airplane mechanic in Bangkok, Thailand during the Vietnam War. He came back with a duffel bag full of it and says, "Here, try this." And I trusted him. He later became a doctor. I knew he was smart. I knew he knew what he was doing. He turned me on to marijuana, and bless his heart, saved my life.
When I was in college, in the graduate school down at Stanford, going through the writing program, we lived in a little community called Perry Lane. And one of our good friends and neighbors was a guy that was enrolled in the drug experiments that were going on in the VA hospital. He didn't really want to do it. Psychologists, by their nature, are cowards. They wouldn't be psychologists. So he said, "Here, you go and do it for me. You get $20 a day. You have to go in every Tuesday at about 8:30. They give you something, and then they test you with test your urine and your blood sugar. They test your reflexes. They see if you can add and subtract. About every hour, they'd come through and do this stuff. And where they were doing it was on the ward in the old Menlo Park hospital, a VA hospital. And when I looked out through this little window, and the little windows that have chicken wire inside of the glass, and looked out there at the ward and saw these people out there, I realized that these people knew something that the doctors didn't know. They were crazy and they were in pain, but they were enlightened in some way. And the villain that they were seeing, and they could sense the thing that was driving them crazy, it didn't have anything to do with Freud. It had to do with America. And they had all followed the correct lines. They'd all been vets. They'd all had good jobs. And something wasn't working. Something was haywire. And they knew it. And either they had to become unpatriotic or just go ahead and be crazy.
In the 1960s, it was a really interesting time period because there were two different cultures that were running parallel to one another. And in many ways, they were really parallel because rarely did they cross. And when they did cross, it usually created some sparks. The one culture was the little home in the suburbs with the polyester suits and the synthetic life of two cats and a dog in the garage and the whole bit. And then there was the counterculture, who was really, I think, pursuing more the natural way of life. They were trying to become more grounded, more environmentally conscious, and more concerned about the things that they were putting into their bodies. And so at that time, drug use took, I think, an interesting twist in that a lot of people were very interested in psychoactive experimentation and turned to a lot of chemicals like speed and acid, for example. But there was also a very strong movement at the time to move into the natural things of life. So at that time, people began to be very interested in marijuana, also very interested in natural clothes, cottons, flaxes and linens and silks and wools, things that were more consistent, I think, with their kind of back to the woods, simple lifestyle.
Hemp, like tobacco and so many things with farmers, is really a victim of the weather. A good season, everything works right, you got a super quality fiber. If it's not good and things turn out not so well, you don't have a good yield and you may have a lower quality fiber. But as it used to be, and we think now would be a use for any of the fiber. It is an oil crop. You look in the botanical files, it's under the oil families. Hemp oil sells at $1 an ounce. You can go out on Southland Drive and buy it today. I think it's $20 a bottle for about 18 ounces, or less, 16 ounces maybe. Hungarians, we've talked to a man in Canada whose parents were from Hungary. He went back to the villages they came from, and they grind up the seed and make hemp butter, just like we have peanut butter. Very nourishing. They feed the school children. And if you take the oil out of it, it's just like soybean meal. You feed all the animals. So, history, the book's full of it. It's a matter of, can we think we've grown so wise or naive or just plain illiterate, that all of a sudden the crop is all bad. And the phenomenon is, when you're eating popcorn, corn makes whiskey. You don't really think about that when you're eating popcorn, though. Or if you like real good sweet corn in the springtime, and wait till hope you can get some, you don't sit there thinking about a bottle of whiskey. The damn plant can make anything out of it.
It's the paper that the Constitution is written on. I used to put up hay with hemp string, by far the best string. The plastic stuff is just terrible to fool with because it all shreds and the cows get it in their toes and you can't get rid of it. The sisal, which we buy, that comes from India, it doesn't have those nice long staples that hemp has. And I've got a big ball over the house made out of hemp twine. And this area would just be a wonderful place to grow it. And you can grow that big old stuff. You can grow it as high as this barn. You don't have much potency to it at all. And my brother and I have laminated chunks of these stalks together and squeezed them down with a cheese press. So you're able to get what are essentially 4x4s with pithy interiors, and they attach together just by their own resins. It'll take a nail, you could saw it. It could be the answer to all these loggers who have run out of trees. This whole valley up there, and the first state that does it is going to be way out in front of the other states.
I have talked with many older women that are farmers that are sincerely interested in industrial hemp as a cash crop. They understand the historical basis of where we've grown industrial hemp. They've done an incredible job of researching what other countries are doing in terms of raising industrial hemp. And they're very interested from a very sincere economic point of view. Could this be the next cash crop for the American farmer? Is there some hope here? There's another faction that supports industrial hemp. Not so much from an alternative fiber perspective, but from the group or the faction that's really sincerely interested in legalizing, if not continuing to decriminalize, the use and production of marijuana in the United States. So there is also a very strong pro-marijuana lobby that's acting that would also like to see industrial hemp being legalized because it's a foot in the door. They're both cannabis sativa.
Let me put it like this. Some people who don't know me give me a reputation for wanting to legalize drugs. I do not want to do that. I'm in the business of trying to license and regulate cannabis as a crop. Tomatoes are legal. Alcohol and tobacco is licensed and regulated. And I seek to license and regulate, take it out of the black market status, just cannabis now. I would take the law enforcement dollar, which we would save off of that we're currently spending on detecting, arresting, prosecuting, and incarcerating people who associate with the cannabis plant. If we change the laws, we'd save all that money. I would go after the hard drugs. I'd go after the synthetic drugs, the crack, the cocaine, the heroin, those kinds of synthetic drugs, man-made drugs, which destroy the spirit and overcome rights of determination and self-choice because they're addictive and destructive to the body.
The spirit itself has become corrupted. Everybody knows that the coke is bad stuff, and it has bad spirit. It runs through a gamut of people that are against enlightenment. They're wanting you to try this stuff that makes you feel powerful, and then it goes away in about 10 minutes. And the people, the local people that we know, are growing little dabs of grass and stuff. Their stuff isn't that strong, but you don't want it that strong. It's one thing that we've learned is you don't need a huge bunch of anything. You can get the same effect with just a little bunch. And we're mature enough to be able to make those kind of decisions. I mean, we've never heard it debated. We've never heard this gateway drug thing debated. You know, they say with grass leads to heroin. You can say the same thing about milk and gin.
If I took this low THC and tried to produce a marijuana, you'd have a hell of a headache. You wouldn't get any, whatever the euphoric is. There's no question that people in Canada can testify they've had no problem with any plot of this stuff, either in England or Canada or some of the other, or Germany. Germany had enough intestinal fortitude in when they took East Germany, they paid one fellow $750,000 to quit raising it. In less than 10 years now, they've turned it loose. Any German farmer can raise it. They learned. They were willing to say we made a mistake. Bam, go on and do something to raise the fiber to help mankind.
Did you hear that plane go over a little bit ago? Mm-hmm. That's a sheriff's deputy's plane. It's a white plane with black wingtips. And it starts about this time in May and continues to fly over our place every day until way late in the fall. And the guy knows I'm not growing anything. And I know he knows. But that's not it. There's sort of a Indian wrestling going on here.
The Drug Enforcement Agency really has continued to fight this issue very, very hard. And from a legal perspective, the U.S. government continues to make no legal distinction between industrial hemp and marijuana. However, interestingly, in terms of our international trade treaties that we have signed, for example, through the GATT or through the World Trade Organization, we do make a legal distinction between marijuana and industrial hemp. And that's why we permit the importation of industrial hemp products in the first place.
For the industrial textile aspects of it, I would let the market control what happened to it. Since it doesn't have any drug content to be reckoned with, it has some, but it's negligible. It won't get anybody high or anything. I'd let the market control that and take the European example and let anybody grow as much as they could as long as they had a contract to sell it to somebody, which gives the market a self-regulatory perspective. You know, there won't be speculation in it. You know, your large landowners won't just go out and just plant acres and acres of it just so to keep the smaller farmer from doing it. If they don't have a market for it, they can't grow it. They got a market for it. The industry wants to buy it, get a contract for it. Yeah, you can grow it.
It's not the money alone that's causing a furor. It's this emotional attachment, this very spiritual soul attachment to the land and its products. And that can run pretty deep. But that also can end very abruptly, too.
I also think in terms of the people who like this as a fad, is that they sincerely believe that we need to get back to a more natural state of things. And industrial hemp is currently being touted as something that's environmentally safe, if not environmentally conducive to having a saner society, to be able to raise and produce products that are sustainable. That we're no longer raping and pillaging the earth. We're no longer cutting the trees down. We're raising a sustainable crop. We're no longer relying on the petrochemical industry, but we're raising a sustainable crop that's environmentally friendly. Now, whether these allegations are true or not, and how environmentally benign industrial hemp actually is, the economic realities, can we really replace wood pulp with hemp pulp? the realities of, can we really gear up all the cars to run on hemp oil rather than petrochemically based products, is irrelevant. The general public doesn't know, and for the most part doesn't care. What they're doing is buying into, I think, a symbol and making the statement that even though they don't quite understand the complexities of the world market, they're making a statement that they really want to do is go back to a more natural created environment and go back to a more natural market.
I personally have no desire to support either side if it could be produced without the narcotic, that side of it, then I'd say glory be. But I think, I'm not in a position to make this official statement, but I'll make it anyway. I don't think it'll be the economic success that the advocates seem to think it might be.
No, I just think we're going to be sucking hind tit if we don't get busy and do the. If we could do the seed research, ideally we could come out and be the best source on the Americas, all up and down there, from Canada all the way to Brazil, Argentina. I'm afraid Canada's already picked up on that seed being in the profitable end of it. Now, climatically, I think we still have a better edge on it if we can get going quickly. Ideally, we'd bring seed here from all sources all over the world and quickly determine the THC level and the oil level and the fiber quality.
You think it'll happen in your lifetime?
Not mine. Not mine. I think my sons will get to see it, and daughters.
All right. We'll end it there. Thank you very much, Jay.
There was a word one time. I used to know it. And a dream I had one winter's night. When the mountains in the east were the mountains in the west. And this old river, it was a friend of mine. The days unfold and spread their gold. The cartwheels cross the moon, and we'll rise again to make our stand against the king's drag.